Good afternoon. My name is Jenny Faubert, and I'm the Editor-in-Chief of Career Education Review. Welcome to our webinar today, presented by Ritzert and Leyton. Thank you for joining us and taking the time today. For those of you who are new to CER or don't know much about us, we are a 90-year publication. We try to provide information to the career education community through original articles, interviews with higher education leaders, admissions trends, compliance and regulatory issues, school operations, and much more. If you are interested in learning more about CER, please feel free to contact me. I'll be happy to answer any questions you have. Now, before we start the webinar, I just want to go through a couple housekeeping. We will be recording the webinar, and it will be available on the Career Education Review website, along with a PDF of the webinar. Most likely it'll be up tomorrow, and you'll receive an email with a link to that information tomorrow afternoon. If you do have any technical issues during the webinar, please send me a message through the chat function. I'll try to get that resolved while we're on the webinar. Also, we will save some time at the end for questions. So if you do have questions that come up throughout the webinar, just go ahead and type those questions into the question feature, and we'll get to those. If we do run out of time, we can stay on a little later, but we can also respond to those through email. So we'll try to get through all of them if we do run out of time, though. So today our presenters are Ben Walker and Steve Chema. I would like to thank them and the rest of the team at Ritzert and Leyton for their continued support of Career Education Review. And without any further ado, I will go ahead and hand it over to Ben to start the presentation.
Well, thank you very much, Jenny, and always a pleasure. Thank you to all the attendees for tuning in today. This webinar is interdepartmental cooperation. We're trying to identify ways to improve it, and we'll go ahead and get started. Have a couple of housekeeping items first. This disclaimer: the views expressed in this webinar and its accompanying materials are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the policy or position of Career Education Review. And in addition, the contents of this presentation and its accompanying materials do not constitute legal or regulatory advice. No one should act or refrain from acting on the basis of this webinar without seeking individualized professional counsel as appropriate. All right. Well, the first question that comes up is why should you care how departments work together to help students enroll, graduate, and obtain a job? First and foremost, it's the primary function of most of these schools. We want to see our students enroll, we want to see them succeed academically, want to see them graduate, and then get a job once they graduate, and ideally in their field of study or related field. So the way in which your departments interact with one another directly impacts the student experience and student satisfaction as well. In addition, inability to cooperate or get along in helping students and furthering the educational mission of your institution can severely hinder institutional operations. Now, on the other side, it can also very much improve them. And in addition, you'll be able to help limit the likelihood of negative findings by the Department of Education, creditors, or state agencies if every department is working together towards that common goal. And I think from a regulatory perspective, the administrative capability regulation is probably the most critical in terms of interdepartmental cooperation. In order to continue your participation in Title IV, the institution must demonstrate to the Secretary that it is capable of adequately administering Title IV programs. And failure to demonstrate administrative capability is an extremely serious finding that arises in the context typically of program reviews or even more troubling, an emergency action by the department. And really what they want to see is, does the school have the knowledge and the resources necessary to properly administer and account for government funds? And if they conclude on the basis that, hey, the financial aid department is telling us the policy is X, and when we talk to someone else in the registrar's office, they tell us it's Y, that can raise some serious concerns about whether or not the institution itself is administering Title IV properly. Um, uh, the way in which departments interact with one another is oftentimes a focus for government investigations because of the nature of financial aid. The financial aid department really touches just about every aspect of your institutional operation in one form or another. There's a few that it doesn't, but really those are really on the periphery. And I would say that that the government wants to come out and see when they are reviewing your operations that the departments are all on the same page in terms of their policy implementation in particular, that practices are standardized, that if a special issue does come up, the institution can deal with it. But generally speaking, for example, here's our policy of determining whether or not a student is eligible to become enrolled. We follow these specific steps, and here's the department responsible for it. It's also become an increasing focus for litigation because if much like the government, if you're getting conflicting stories regarding what an institution's policy or procedure is, it's a chink in the armor, as they say, and a way to say, hey, there's something else we need to be looking at or something more sinister going on here. And in addition, I think we've found that the way in which coworkers and departments interact with one another can have a pretty profound impact upon your current employees and your former employees, and it can be a source of real discontent. It's amazing what people remember once they leave an institution, and if they leave on good terms because they've had a good experience, they've felt like valued members of a team who cooperated with their coworkers, the likelihood of that, I think, is reduced substantially. And what we see in our practice is external forces driving change across institutions. A lot of times it's nothing internal that requires a policy update, a procedure update. It's these outside forces that are requiring it. That's the department, in particular Department of Education, as well as changes at accrediting agency requirements or state requirements. And so a lot of this, of what the institution must keep up with is a little bit of reacting to what the changes are. But if you're monitoring them closely and watching the department's press releases and things like that, you may be able to anticipate some areas where you're going to see a change and go ahead and get ahead of it. One I can think of in the past few years has been when the department did away with the incentive compensation ban safe harbors in 2011. They announced that in 2010, well in advance of when the actual regulation changed. So we worked with several of institutional clients we have to get ahead of it, to have their policy changed and ready to go so that as soon as the actual regulatory change was enacted, they were ready to go and are going to be fully compliant. And I'm going to turn it over now to Steve to cover financial aid.
Thanks, Ben. Well, we thought it would make sense to begin, with financial aid, and we are dubbing it our primary area of concern. And it's because the financial aid department has a bullseye on it, and that is when you think about this multitude of regulatory requirements that are out there affecting the institution as a whole, just so many of them are reflected in the U.S. Department of Ed's regulations or on conditions of participation in federal student aid programs. So, the financial aid department becomes this point of reference that we want to use to explain just how important it is that how it's running and how other related departments within your school need to be able to collaborate and function smoothly. So, with that, we ask the question, well, what departments exactly, impact financial aid operations? And, the short answer is we think just about all of them do. Really, if you are in a department that has any, meaningful student interaction, you can pretty much assume that, yes, whatever it is that you do has some ripple effect on the financial aid operations of the school and on the people who work in that department. So we'll take a little tour across, some departments. Obviously, we recognize that, these are what we think are typical examples based on our experience. We understand that there are a bunch of different ways that you can set up your institution, and so what you see on this slide and on the next, coming slides may not be exactly how you do it, but I think if that's the case, you'll still appreciate what we're trying to say here. So starting with the academic department, clearly there's some pretty easy connections back to financial aid and financial aid regulations, and unfortunately bad consequences to the institution when those regulations are not complied with. You'll see attendance. The classroom that's where attendance happens. Same with grading, and that's these events, an event of attendance, a student earning a grade or not attending, or earning a failing grade or withdrawing grade, all impacts what the financial aid department is going to do with respect to determining the institution's responsibility to return funds that were not earned to the Department of Education, and in particular to particular grant and loan programs. Similarly, they have to factor into grades and attendance. They factor into satisfactory academic progress calculations, which is a eligibility condition that determines whether or not any particular student can continue to receive Title IV loans or grants. And so how the process of recognizing, recording, communicating these events, grade events, attendance events, has a material and necessary impact on those two functions. But there's a lot more going on, and certainly more than you're going to see just on the slide. These are essentially examples that Ben and I developed because we thought that it would get the idea across. So when we refer to basic eligibility assessments here, we're thinking, well, it's your overall academic decision making as to what are the criteria for admission to the school, admission to a program, and how are we setting those? If you're an open admission institution, it might be pretty simple, but on the other hand, you might be a school that has a number of allied health programs, and those require prerequisites, or you may have degree programs that require other kinds of degree programs that require prerequisites or co-requisites. You may administer placement examinations just to try to understand whether students at the point at which they're enrolling will require any remedial education in order to make sure they have the best chance for success, or whether they can enter without that. Finally, transfer of credits, those kinds of decisions and how they're made impact students in a similar way. This would, of course, dictate whether a student enters the program in any kind of advanced standing. And those decisions, whether a student's going to receive remedial courses or be required to take them, or whether they have achieved academic success at a prior institution or at some prior time that warrants the acceptance of transfer credits, is going to have an impact on, or at least potentially an impact on, that student's Title IV eligibility. And it's important to remember, I think, while coming up with or making decisions about eligibility assessments or transfer of credit policies, that there is this impact on financial aid, and it's important to understand what that is. And probably one good way to do that is to make sure how they interoperate. But that is the academic example. Ben, if you want to move us up to the next slide. Admissions has some pretty clear connections back to Title IV as well. The admissions office is the gatekeeper for those institutional eligibility requirements, or otherwise known as your admissions requirements. So they're going to be the folks typically who are out there obtaining records like high school diploma, proof of high school graduation, and other requirements you may have established as the basic requirements for admission into either the institution or in a particular program. So making sure that they understand exactly what is needed in terms of what the financial aid office is going to rely on, because not only are these institutional eligibility requirements, but they might also be on the second bullet, Title IV eligibility requirements. For example, the high school proof of high school graduation certainly is that. So we know that when the Department of Education comes out to see you as part of a typical program review, they're going to want to know a couple of things. They're going to want to know, do you collect proof of high school graduation? And if you do, at the admissions department, you probably need to be doing that. Those documents probably need to be made available to financial aid. It's going to be expected that any decisions about the student's eligibility on that criterion are going to be documented. And so if you're collecting the documentation but it doesn't wind up where it needs to be, that could be a problem. Similarly, they're going to want you to have a policy for evaluating what is a valid high school diploma. The idea being that there are institutions out there, secondary educational institutions, that are in fact diploma mills, and they want the schools to be somewhat vigilant in trying to determine what is or what isn't a qualifying high school diploma. So that policy needs to exist, and it's really a financial aid policy because it dictates financial aid eligibility, but it might also dictate whether the student's really eligible to be enrolled in the school. So both your admissions office and your financial aid office have to live by that policy, but who's trained on it? Who understands it, and who's really implementing it? It's probably admissions. The big point of emphasis coming from the department lately, however, has been on consumer protection issues flowing out of substantial misrepresentations about things like transferability of credits, how much your program costs, aspects of the program that, like its placement rate, or other things which are typically, part of the admissions discussion. These are people who are trying to establish that your school is a good fit for this prospective student, and it's very likely that a student will, in this day and age, will come armed, asking some questions about, well, where do I go once I have this this diploma, degree, or certificate in hand from your institution? So it's really vitally important that admissions personnel understand what a misrepresentation is. They understand that their communications about these topics have to be accurate, have to be truthful, and they can't be confusing. And if that understanding isn't there, or if there is a deviation from those policies, that's going to have a direct impact on the financial aid department, because you're going to have students who may have grounds for complaining to the department, which could lead to program reviews triggered that grow to an investigation of pretty much everything happening at your institution. Additionally, there has been, obviously, with some of the headline grabbing incidents that have occurred at larger institutions, this idea of defense to loan repayment and misrepresentation that arises to essentially a fraudulent statement to a student is frequently being cited as a basis for defense to repayment of federal student loans. So there are it's very difficult to understate or underestimate the potential impact in the financial aid realm to how the admissions department functions. That's just another basis for why you need to have these two groups communicating and understanding each other. And let's go ahead to the next slide. In your sort of financial services departments, your bursar or your accounting departments, they too are important links in this chain of processing and transacting in Title IV funds. In particular, your bursar is going to be the one who's going to be distributing or dispersing Title IV credit balances. Those amounts above what the student owes for tuition and fees that typically represent what they might be getting for housing and other related expenses. Clearly, there are rules that relate to those items. They have to be dispersed on time, but they also have to be dispersed in a particular way. And you have numerous options, as you can see from the second bullet point. Could be check, could be cash, you could do a debit, prepaid card, or some kind of EFT. But keeping in mind, you can't charge any fees that would reduce the ultimate amount of the credit balance the student receives. So understanding that, at this office, which is actually implementing this, and even at business offices that might be establishing relationships with payors like banks or other financial institutions that would be handling your electronic transactions or your credit or debit card payments is very important. Additionally, the ability to accurately track student payments for things like fees and equipment has some pretty significant Title IV financial aid repercussions too, because you have to be allocating those payments properly. It's going to impact things like the school's 90-10 calculation, or even its gainful employment rates, because when those gainful employment debt to earnings ratios are calculated, it's going to be based on a number which couldn't exceed tuition and fees. If you are charging extraordinary items that are really part of your cost of attendance but not tuition and fees, you have to make sure that those are coded properly. Otherwise, you might be raising that ceiling for GE purposes. And the career services and placement departments, they too are areas at which there's at least a possibility for misrepresentations to occur, specifically, any sort of improper promises of employment, or that you would achieve a salary of a certain amount upon employment. But those offices too are important because they're not only out there trying to achieve these positive outcomes for the institution and its students, but they're going to be most likely at your institution the folks who are also creating a log or tallying up those successful placements, which becomes ultimately part of what you're exposing to the public as part of your gainful employment web disclosures and other places where those GE disclosures might happen to wind up. Additionally, not just for gainful employment reasons, but your outcomes get measured, certainly by most of the accreditors that accredit career institutions. And tracking and accurately reporting those statistics is another major point of emphasis that the department is and others, and such as the private litigation bar, have been focusing on when they're trying to establish that there are schools that are doing it wrong. They are looking very, very closely not just at the decisions that are made, but also whether there's any process to validate or verify this data. So with all that happening in a career services placement office or department, again, the ripples go out, the consequences get felt based on, get felt in financial aid and to the institution's Title IV participation. In the registrar's office, there too, there's, I think we find that the registrar, unfortunately, sometimes gets to be the bearer of bad news on a number of fronts. One of those would be the transfer credit issue. Sometimes it's up to that office to communicate what a decision was to deny transfer credits, and that frequently that communication frequently becomes the basis for a student claim. Well, I was promised that my credits would transfer, and here they are telling me that they won't. Similarly, it may fall upon this office to explain that a student who's failed to attend for a certain period of time, could be 14 consecutive days if your school is one of the schools that has a policy like that, which results in an administrative withdrawal. This is something again that students are frequently complaining, well, I was never told, or I wasn't aware that this consequence would arise from my failure to attend. And of course, because they control the scheduling, the course scheduling for students, the discussion sometimes becomes, well, I can't place you in this class that you wanted to take at this term because you haven't fulfilled a course prerequisite. With respect to R2T4, those official withdrawal decisions that I mentioned, or unofficial withdrawal decisions I mentioned earlier, obviously become a part of the process for determining, well, where do we stand? Do we have to return money to the Department of Education, or do we not? Do we need to make a post-withdrawal disbursement directly to the student, or do we not? And of course, the registrar is also usually a point of contact for a student to declare that they aren't coming back if in fact they are an official withdrawal. Finally, the last sort of category of bad news that a registrar sometimes is delivering to students is that, well, we are responsible for making sure that you are keeping your satisfactory academic progress up, and unfortunately, student, you have failed to do this. And as a result, you are not eligible for federal financial aid in the next term unless you can complete a successful appeal, and here's the appeal process. So, understanding that, this office is at the intersection of all this, unfortunately, negative communication, at least potentially negative communication with students, means that, the possibility of a student complaint, the possibility of the Department of Education or some other regulators' involvement may increase. And there are, again, these repercussions that reach back into the financial aid department and your Title IV participation. Next, we wanted to highlight campus security. Maybe it's one that doesn't immediately come to mind so much as some of the other departments that we've mentioned so far in the presentation, but campus security, specifically, compliance with the Clery Act, is a requirement. It's something that's stated as a positive certification in your program participation agreement with the department, that you will, as a condition of your ongoing participation, fulfill your duties under the Clery Act, which includes making sure that you've got personnel on campus who referred to sometimes as campus security authorities, who are in a position to receive reports directly from students or witnesses who have witnessed a crime or been a victim of a crime. Those CSAs, campus security authorities, typically will then make a report to a campus security officer, and that person is probably charged with keeping a log of all that information, which ultimately becomes part of your annual security report, which is required under the Clery Act to be reported to the department on an annual basis, but also publicly disclosed to students and other people who ask for it. You probably have a Clery Act notice that explains exactly where and how a student can obtain that information. The campus security office also has to, when they're formulating that report, they have to make some judgment calls from time to time on classifying, different types of offenses that may have occurred on campus or within, what's referred to as the Clery geography. And those decisions, can't be taken too lightly, because they might be the difference between actually reporting an offense as one of the several categories of offenses that the Clery Act says has to be in the report, or making a decision that the student or that the offense doesn't qualify and doesn't need to be included in that particular ASR. And where this winds up having consequences for the institution is that if an institution fails to report a otherwise reportable Clery Act offense, it's very likely that the institution will receive a fine or worse from the Department of Education if there's some sort of repetitive and systemic failure to report. This has become a point of emphasis for the last couple of years. The department had established a Clery Act team whose specific reason for being is to review any findings coming out of a program review report to determine if a fine or any other appropriate sanction should be taken. And in addition to reviewing all of those findings, they also monitor press reports for things like active shooter situations that get broadcast through the media to assess whether or not a school responded to it appropriately. So there's a whole lot of interest at the department on making sure schools are complying with the Clery Act, and the ultimate sanction is not a fine, but it's the ability to limit, suspend, or terminate a school's Title IV participation. So, here too, you've got these very clear ramifications on whether or not you're going to be able to continue participating in Title IV and on your financial aid office. So just to wind up, our sort of departmental, view, we acknowledge that there are, many others out there. Compliance officers, compliance departments, it's pretty clear that they would have a role. They're out there in sort of two ways, I think. Typically, they've got a proactive role where they're out assessing how we are complying with federal regulations, particularly Title IV regulations across the institution, but also reacting. How do we, when we do see an issue or a problem, how do we react to that? How are we taking a good corrective action, and hopefully minimizing any problems that might arise? Student services, fits very tightly into that prior slide of placement assistance, but I think there are other roles at a school where student services, also make a difference to your overall administration of Title IV, and that, one way might be academic counseling. Say you've got a student who is placed on an academic plan because, he had failed SAP in the prior term, and in order to make sure that the student is following an academic plan, because the student wants to retain Title IV eligibility following a successful SAP appeal, that probably involves tutoring and counseling from your student services, and their ability to make sure the student is following through with that plan is going to be important, because ultimately, that is a step for complying with the results of the successful appeal, but it might also, in another example, be a basis by which a student can hope to establish Title IV eligibility after failing SAP and not being able to successfully appeal. Information technology, your IT department, pretty clearly that if you do in any kind of distance education, if you've got a learning management system or a campus management system, these are big lifeblood systems that your school probably can't function effectively unless they're properly maintained and integrated with each other, and having the availability, of course, prevent, or having a lack of availability of these systems would of course prevent financial aid from being able to do its job, and could raise questions ultimately if student complaints arise as to your overall administrative capability. And keep in mind too that your IT department is probably going to be the department that's responsible for, maybe in conjunction with your compliance department, with maintaining a data security plan to protect personally identifiable information, and also for auditing the effectiveness of that plan. Okay, so outside of just thinking about departments, there are, under the umbrella of administration and senior administration, some other figures that that definitely have an impact and definitely need to be aware of financial aid rules and procedures, and how they, even if it's not part of their job description, might impact the administration of Title IV at your program or at your institution. And certainly at the highest level, your chief executive officer, your dean, your chancellor, your president, the buck stops with them typically. But there are specific regulations that could have a surprising impact on Title IV. One of those is a regulation that is part of the institutional eligibility regulations that basically says that an institution can't be eligible if its owner or its chief executive officer has pled guilty or has pled nolo contendere, no contest, or is found guilty of a crime involving the acquisition, use, or expenditure of Title IV funds, or if such a person has been judicially determined to have committed a fraud involving Title IV program fraud, funds. So if you've got someone in the position of chief executive officer or who's an owner of the institution that has that kind of criminal background, doesn't matter when it happened, how long ago, if this becomes known to the department, it could be a disqualifying event for the entire institution with pretty clearly catastrophic consequences. In addition, there's another regulation that's part of the program participation agreement, wherein the institution promises in that agreement that it will not willingly employ in a capacity that involves the administration of Title IV HEA programs or the receipt of funds under those programs any individual who has been convicted of or has pled no contest or guilty to a crime involving the acquisition, use, or expenditure of federal, state, or local government funds, or has been administratively or judicially determined to have committed fraud or any other material violation of law involving federal, state, or local government funds. So this one's a lot broader. It involves not just the CEO, but any person who has the capacity to impact the administration of Title IV funds, and that has been primarily understood, I think, to still involve certainly the C-level personnel as well as director of financial aid, but certainly there's a little bit of ambiguity as to what the administration of Title IV programs means for this regulation, but clearly, those kinds of criminal background issues could be fatal for your ongoing participation in Title IV. I'd also raise another regulation which goes to past performance, and this affects, again, a pretty broad base of individuals that could be in departments or functions or have job descriptions that don't directly relate necessarily to Title IV, or at least not in the way that not in an obvious way. And that is this idea of past performance, which is part of the department's federal standards for financial responsibility. And this regulation essentially says that your institution is not financially responsible if there's a person who had substantial control at another institution that closed owing liability for Title IV funds to the department. And really, it's actually, if you are employing such a person who had substantial control, or a relative of such a person. And what the department means by substantial control is if that person or a family member was a 25% owner, or 25% or higher of an institution, or if they were the CEO or CFO. But it gets so much. It gets expanded to such a great extent because of this family tie. We once had a case of an employee at an institution that was informed that they were failing this financial responsibility test because of past performance issues for their financial aid director, and it wasn't because the financial aid director was an owner or a CEO or a CFO of some other institution that closed owing a liability to the department. It was that director's parent did. So there are these lurking background issues that can be present that make a difference even for people that do not in a day-to-day capacity always have their fingers on financial aid. But of course, vice presidents and general counsel in this second tier of administration can also, in some instances, trigger other regulations or requirements that impact Title IV. For example, on the VP level, we'd be remiss if we didn't mention incentive compensation. Oftentimes, you may have a admissions manager or a financial aid manager who is given a VP title. The department's regulations make it clear that the incentive compensation, the application of that incentive compensation ban does roll up to the highest level. So it's possible that you may have covered employees for the purposes of that role, which, again, can lead to significant enforcement consequences if it's violated. Coordinators are positions that are statutorily or through the regulations required by Title IV or by Title VII or Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, Title IX of the Educational Amendments, or the Americans with Disabilities Act. These are people who you have to have in place, and failure to appoint these positions can create liability.
Next, we're going to move into a discussion of coordination cooperation. I'm going to move pretty quick. Really, what the prior piece was expressing was how intertwined all these departments are in ways that a lot of times you might not even think of, and that's why these compliance considerations come up, and they arise in the context of Department of Education program reviews and audit determinations. Also, your auditors' on-site work in completing your annual audits, compliance audits and FSA audits. Oftentimes they'll want to speak to individuals in various departments and review your policy statements. And so what you want to see overall is consistency among those. And in our view, the most effective way to ensure consistency is to get multiple departments looking at policies and procedures and doing a double check and providing input about how their piece of the puzzle might fit into that policy statement. But the same compliance considerations apply in terms of accrediting agency site visits and in compiling annual reports. Again, requires a great deal of can require a great deal of heavy lifting, and so the ways in which you improve the way the department's cooperation in working towards this common goal can really help and make that an easier process instead of the painful one that it may be at times. Similar concern with state agencies and obviously for students. Again, I think consistency is sort of the watchword here. A student should be getting similar information if they ask the same question of more than one person. Maybe a student services representative and their admissions rep. If they have a question about eligibility for another program or transferring credits from one program to another, they should be making sure they're getting consistent information across the board. And that's why ensuring that your various departments have bought into sort of a standard expectation for what we say when the student asks this question, even if it's, you know what, I don't really have the answer to that question, but you need to see someone in X department. That's a really effective way to handle a lot of this. It doesn't mean to say that everyone is an expert in everything, but knowing what department is responsible for what areas of operation can also make it easier to direct a student to the appropriate person who can help them out. Policy setting is obviously critical. It's a focus of program reviews. They're going to want to see a very complete binder of all your policy and procedure statements. So you're going to be needing to be updating those policies either for external reasons, that is because you're obligated to review them annually, or you're obligated to be holding meetings wherein discussions take place to determine whether or not there's a reason to update a policy, or for internal reasons. Internal reasons really just operational. Hey, we think we could be more efficient in this area, and we think our policy is a little bit outdated, and we'd like to streamline it or improve it. Is there a way we can take out a step or a series of steps? Is there something that we can meet with the student once instead of meeting with them 3 times to request documents? Is there a way that we can use a document that defines what documents, a checklist of sorts, what documents are necessary so that the student can take that checklist home and make sure they're getting all of their information together in one place and all their data together in one place. And appending that as part of a policy statement can often be very effective because it shows to a reviewer not only do you understand what the expectations were, but you put it in a format that a student can really understand and take with them. Oftentimes that's really useful because you're not relying upon someone to verbally communicate necessarily what the student needs, but you follow up that verbal communication with a discrete checklist that says, hey, bring in these pieces of data, we'll be needing those, and we'll be better able to help you and assess you all in one step if you bring it all in together, rather than, hey, I brought my taxes in today, ooh, we forgot, we need to let you know you also need your parents' taxes, or something like that. There's also just your human resources considerations. Your organizational responsibilities, are there areas of overlap? Is there one department that's doing something that another department really should be taking care of? And do you have adequate checks and balances? I think is also a critical piece. Is there someone looking at how these determinations are made to make sure that that there's a second set of eyes? And you also simply have your negative impacts of non-cooperation. Oftentimes we find, as an easy example, you have an FA department and an admissions department. They're a little bit at loggerheads. The admissions department thinks the FA department is taking forever, delaying students' ability to enroll, and the FA department thinks admissions is rushing too many students through too quickly and it's overwhelming them. And so I think that, in our experience, getting those departments together as an example to work together on what the process is, what the expectation is in terms of how you're dealing with students can often go a long way towards diffusing tensions and helping those two groups cooperate in a more useful manner. And the other issue that comes up that we see is if there isn't non-cooperation or bad blood between departments, you end up with people who are unwilling to raise issues or problems. And really what I've seen at any rate is problems are going to come up, and it's better to know what they are and get ahead of them than to be blindsided. So you want your staff to be raising issues for you. And it doesn't mean that you have to take everything they say as the gospel truth and implement every suggestion someone has, but at least let them know that you're listening to them and you want to hear about problems they're seeing in the workplace and finding and identifying ways to smooth those out. And that really relates to these really positive impacts of buy-in and agreement. You're going to have people implementing policy in a clear and consistent fashion. You're going to have them following procedures that are consistent, that are done day to day the same way, so you don't have these outliers. And that's not to say you can eliminate them entirely. There's always going to be outliers and always going to be an instance when an exception may need to be made, but you really do want those to be the exceptions, not the rule. And you're also going to have more clear lines of responsibility. I know what my counterpart is taking care of. I don't have to worry about his piece of the puzzle. I know he's handling it, and I know if I have a question about it because it impacts the way I do my job, I can go to this person, ask them, and get a straightforward answer or help to resolve the concern. And this is going to really help in terms of your ongoing readiness. The department does have unannounced visits. Or in an emergency situation. And I think campus security is sort of the watchword for that, or the best example to give. In terms of emergency preparedness plan, is the institution ready to implement it if something, heaven forbid, were to come up? Such that it's second nature. If your emergency coordinator has to go grab the policy statement to figure out who she needs to contact and how she needs to contact students, that's going to be a problem because it's going to really delay the institutional response. So we think this sort of ongoing readiness is really an important concern.
All right, so we think at this point we've made the case for why cooperation and collaboration are really good things to have across your institution. And so there are now some things we thought should be the focus of how you can lead change or implement new policies or strategies at your institution. Ben, you want to roll forward one slide? There we go. First is, taking a look at your information flow and making sure that it's reaching the right people. But I think looking at it not as a two-way street is important too. I mean, it's important certainly to be able to roll out a new policy or procedure by effectively telling everyone who's got a role to play in this what it is they're expected to do and why they're expected to do it. But I think before you even get there, it's very helpful for this process for there to be an ability to effectively solicit feedback from stakeholders or participants in whatever this operation is that you're contemplating. I mean, it certainly doesn't mean that you have to relinquish your control if you're senior management, if you're in charge of some initiative. I mean, these things necessarily have to be flowing from the top down, but I think there is a certain consulting among the personnel that you're going to be relying on to implement that you can do on the front end, and I think we think that this is also a fairly empowering thing to do when it's done properly. A second area of focus is specifically what are your practices for developing policy and implementing them, and with that it's really becomes a question of assessing what maybe has worked before and what hasn't. What are the challenges that we've learned from. What is the nature of the problem we have to solve, and what are our tools that we can use to solve it? Taking sort of an inventory of those things at the outset, and then identifying the right people to have in the room, I think is a good method to begin with for effective policy development. Finally, you want to be aware, and I think maybe this is probably the main idea of this entire presentation, is that if you don't have buy-in and cooperation and collaboration, you're likely to make changes at your institution at one point or another that are going to lead to unintended consequences. Oftentimes what looks good on paper, when put to practice, you realize things that you just couldn't see in the planning stage. And when there are silo type structures at institutions that aren't communicating with each other, you could have examples like if you have a program development team that's coming up with a new and better program alternative that's going to really do great things for the community and bring more students in and put your school on the map for some area of discipline. They may be doing some really innovative stuff, but the reality is that the ways programs are structured, for instance, if you're a school that does standard academic terms or at least is term-based, there are corresponding financial aid implications for how that is awarded to students. And if you're using new and different ideas, you have to be able to incorporate your financial aid folks into that process because they may need to learn an entirely new way to do FA. Doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. You probably should do it. All the reasons that you think an initiative like a new program, like competency-based programs or distance learning or any sort of innovative process or idea you have might work for your institution, you should go ahead and explore it. But remember that there's a sort of some back-end processing consequences. We were actually asked prior to the webinar if we could come up with some training ideas. So we incorporated these slides, and of course in the abstract it's hard to know if how well these would work for what might have been in the mind of the person who sent us that request, but we do thank you. And what we thought would be useful to share with everybody is one way to try to foster an atmosphere of cooperation and collaboration and understanding at your institution might be to do a little bit of shadowing or have a ride-along. In other words, have people from your admissions department go and spend a few hours at the desk with an FA consultant, and they might be able to, at the end of that, walk a mile in their shoes. And I think that might help, start some of the conversations which can lead to, streamlining some things. In addition, because you want to have a cooperative, collaborative atmosphere, whenever possible, maybe involve key personnel from linked departments in the interviewing and hiring stage when you're bringing on significant employees, because having their assessment of how well is this person going to fit in with our culture and are they a team player might be important, more important than you think, and it ought to be a part of, I think, the hiring decision. Finally, when looking at the policies that you're establishing or drafting, why not circulate this in draft form to various members of your departments to get their take on, is this readable? Does it make sense? Are the roles and the expectations clear for this document? Because it's much better to hear that on the front end than try to overcome those problems once you've made a lot of decisions and invested time and energy in the policy later on. We also think that the operation of institutional self-assessment is something that I'm sure we're all pretty familiar with. We're actually required, institutions are required in some discrete areas to do this on a periodic basis. For instance, when you look at your drug and alcohol prevention policies, or if you're looking at your campus safety emergency response plans. These are plans that you're supposed to assess for their effectiveness every so often, every 2 years in the context of drug and alcohol, of course. And so there's a little bit of checking your work and borrowing that concept and applying it to other places, we think is a good thing. And certainly it happens at every institution every few years or so when you're going through your reaccreditation cycle and you've got a document that's supposed to be looking at the entire institution, your institutional self-assessment. Why not use that opportunity too? I don't just dispatch each department to write its own piece, or certainly allow them to do that, but convene everybody in a committee of the whole and read through the document and take comments. It can be a very productive exercise. Something else we really wanted to emphasize is that trying to put yourself in the student's shoes is also going to be pretty critical to the success of trying to implement some of the things we're talking about today. And that's because when I was going through the earlier part of the presentation, pointing out all these unfortunate consequences and how problems in disparate areas of the institution can somehow lead to federal trouble or accreditation trouble, so often that's touched off because of student complaints. So having a student-centric approach, analyzing what it is you're trying to do and how you get your work done from the student perspective is extremely valuable in the ways that it could lead to a reduced incidence of student complaints. I mean, we of course don't believe that could ever be eliminated completely, but we do think that you might have some positive results by lowering student complaints. Particularly if you can take a look at your own processes and see areas in which, well, geez, do we come across as a little too bureaucratic or not transparent enough? Are there students who are having interaction with one department, then going to another department where they actually relay their concerns that never get back to the department that's actually the subject of the problem? Can we do something about that? Finally, there are a lot of resources out there, many of which aren't even may not even cost anything, that you can leverage by as teaching tools for perhaps people who aren't the intended audience. I mean, why not send some people from student services or admissions to some of the financial aid training that the Department of Education offers, both virtual or in person. Same thing with the accreditor or webinars like this one. So these things are out there, and when you find one that speaks to what your institution's trying to accomplish, share it across your institution.
Next, we're going to go through some policy development ideas, and really I'm going to move through this pretty quickly as well. And what we wanted to point out was where your stakeholders are in the various departments, and just identify, based on some of our experience, uh, what departments might or should, or you might want to think about, consider having input in your policy and procedure development. So admissions, academics, certainly the admissions department, student services, student complaints, academics, human resources, and I say that because human resources needs to know if there's a concern with a particular employee. So you'd like to have them have some input in terms of how a student complaint might be handled. In addition, often your HR employees have a lot of experience handling complaints. They can have good and valuable input on some proactive ways to respond, or ways in which you need to act to ensure confidentiality or to give people perhaps an anonymous way to report concerns. In terms of return to Title IV, academics, as they take attendance, they're probably going to need to have some input on how that attendance is then used to determine when a student has withdrawn. The registrar and your IT department, and I say IT because the instructor may take the attendance, they may hand it off to the registrar to enter into the system, but then it needs to be maintained in that system. So you want to make sure that IT is able to handle what's needed, is able to readily deliver the reports that are needed for the financial aid to make its R2T4 determinations. Verification, sort of a similar group in terms of, in particular, departments that may be useful in assisting students identify the documents they need to bring in for verification, or in reaching out to students to remind them, hey, you still need to complete this, it's required, and here's what you need to do. Title IX and Clery Act campus safety requirements. Certainly your Title IX coordinators are going to be key. Your campus security staff, if you have them, assuming there's a security guard who works at the campus or on the campus, that's the individual that's probably going to be, or likely to be, a recipient of a complaint about an incident, and so that person needs to know what the expectations are in terms of how he or she handles that complaint. Really, and I think the important thing to note for the Title IX and Clery Act campus safety requirements is that reports have to flow up, typically, to make sure they're handled properly. And so you want to make sure that individuals are aware if they receive a complaint about a crime event, sexual misconduct, even domestic abuse occurring at home, at the student's home, what they need to do with that information. And so that's why we also included your academics, your student services, and your admissions department. We know that oftentimes the admissions representative forges a pretty strong bond with the student, can often meet them in the hallway, send emails every now and again because the student wants to update them on how they're doing. So that becomes a little bit of a confidant and someone that they might disclose a problem with sexual misconduct going on campus or concern. And so you want to make sure that those individuals have some ability to give input about how that policy is going to work, how that procedure is going to work in the event they do get such a report. And perhaps overarching the entire thing, as I noted before, would be, do these individuals know what they're required to do if they get such a report or get such information from a student? And that can come verbally, email, text, however the student communicates it to them. Do they know what to do next or who to go to for help? Americans with Disabilities Act, similar. What are the accommodation requests that are reasonable? Can you get ahead of some of these requirements so that you don't have to retool your entire online program to accommodate a student that has a disability and needs a special dispensation or a special accommodation? And so that's how I thought, academics, IT, student services, facilities certainly critical for ADA. Are the facilities handicap accessible? Is there a good way for students to move, students with disabilities to move from one place to another without undue hardship? Those sort of considerations really do come into play. And
Well,
I'm
I
an
guess,
acknowledgement to receive for future challenges.
thanks, Ben. It comes to me to end us on a little bit of a sour note, I guess I realize, which is to talk a little bit about the environment that we're facing, and certainly it's not getting any easier. We're about 72 hours into the life with the Student Aid Enforcement Unit. In case some of you haven't heard, there was a press conference just this week at the Department of Education where they announced the creation of the Student Aid Enforcement Unit, which is, as you can see here, dedicated to taking or continuing the administration's aggressive action to protect students and taxpayers and respond more quickly and efficiently to allegations of illegal actions by higher education institutions. So the good news is they're just going after the bad guys, and everybody listening is probably going to be fine. But this does indicate that we're still in an environment where the Department of Education and other federal agencies and state actors are going to continue to look very closely at reports of bad behavior, noncompliance, and illegal activity, and they're beefing up their capabilities to begin investigations and to use tools that they perhaps have always had at their disposal, like subpoenas and other actions. But I guess what I want to hammer home about this group is that I think, and it's hard to know until we get to see a little bit about how they do their job, but what Ben mentioned at the very beginning of the introduction of this presentation and in some of his comments throughout it, I think still will ring true even when dealing with this group, which is that if you have a well-functioning campus and if you have consistency in the implementation of your policies, and if people are really on the same page, when you get inquiries and when you get on-site visits because you're the target of some kind of investigation, you're less likely to raise red flags or to have their radar go up. And that is an incredibly valuable thing, because even though they're going to plow something like $14 million more in the next budget, hopefully they think, to this effort, they're still going to have finite resources. And so the initial part of an investigation, they're going to be looking specifically for evidence that there's something not right at an institution where they've had a complaint that causes them to want to come out and see you. So your ability to respond to that confidently and with consistency, I think is pretty crucial to any chance you have to resolve things without a very prolonged process. But of course, that's speculative from me. We will have to see how it goes, but we do think that some of the ideas that we're sharing here today will be useful even with this group. So Jenny, would you like to turn it over for questions?
Sure. At this time, doesn't look like we have anything in. So if you do have a question, go ahead and send that in now. I just want to mention it once again that we are recording the webinar, and we will have that available up on the Career Education Review website tomorrow afternoon, along with a PDF of the presentation. If anyone does have questions that they want to reach out to us individually, feel free to send them to me or Ben or Steve. If you send them directly to me, I will get them to Ben and Steve. Otherwise, you can contact them directly also.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jenny. We've had good success in responding to questions that have come in, have gotten some good ones on other topics we've covered in these webinars, and I think have been pretty successful in helping people at least get some ideas about how to confront some issues, and our contact information will be provided with the webinar once Jenny posts it.
Perfect. So stay tuned for our next webinar. I'll get you information on that probably next week. We'll be doing another webinar next month, so stay tuned. And with that, I will just thank everyone for attending, and thank you, Ben and Steve, for your presentation today.
Absolutely. Thank you very much to all the attendees.